giving the book report. Mark, you want to start?
Yeah, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm going to start by sharing a screen here. Okay. Everybody got that?
Yep.
Okay. So this is going to be a little bit of a different book review, probably not as light in terms of a topic as sometimes we like to read. I'm personally like to read science fiction and history and mystery novels, etc. However, after the killing of George Floyd last year and the horrific events of the last several years, I was motivated by, like a lot of folks, to learn more about the history and realities of the racial situation in the U.S. So I ended up reading a book focused on that topic, which had been recommended to me by several friends and saw it in news stories, etc. And in light of the fact that tomorrow is actually the one-year anniversary of the George Floyd killing, it decided it seemed like a good time to review that book here today. So I'm going to use a few slides here and make that easier to follow. The book is called Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents, and I'll explain that in a second. Somebody needs to go on mute there if they can.
I'm gonna mute everybody, and then Mark, you'll have to unmute yourself.
Okay. All right. Good.
Okay.
It's written by Isabel Wilkerson, who is a New York Times author, and she's been around the New York Times, I think, for about 30 years. She's won a couple of Pulitzer Prizes, and she also wrote a book called The Warmth of Other Suns, which is very well known and respected. It's about the migration of blacks from the South to the North in the 20s and 30s to escape the Jim Crow laws. And this book has been very well received, and it's won numerous awards. It's also caused a bit of controversy with some groups, but it was pretty limited. I can explain that in a second. But it's really clear, concise, accessible, and importantly, it's really well researched and documented. But it is easy to read. It is long, so it's a little painful to read at times as well because of the topic. But overall, it was really worth the effort. So let me. Slides here. So a few points about just to highlight, what the overall summary of the book was, and then I'll give you a little bit of background after that in a second. Her main point is that over time, that the racial structure and the embedded systemic racism of the U.S. has a lot of direct parallels with and even resembles in many ways the Indian caste system, and especially in terms of the impact on society. And I'm sure everybody's heard about the Indian caste system with the 4 or sometimes 5 levels, with Brahmins on the top and the Dalits and on the bottom, sort of, and then the untouchables. And I included a definition here from the book about what a caste is. And it's really regarded, and this is generally accepted term, as a system-wide system of social stratification characterized by notions of hierarchy, inclusion, and exclusion, and purity by race. So that's the main contention in the book that leads it off. I want to caveat that by saying that she is not asserting that anybody explicitly defined or tried to go out to define a caste system in the U.S. Or formed one like we have in India. But what is clear from a lot of studies that she's done and other scholars have done, that our system started out very much like a caste system when we had slavery, and it still has evolved into something similar. Now this is, and now it's evolved from more of an explicit system like in slavery into more of an implicit system, which I can explain a little bit. It's predominantly affected blacks, but it's not been exclusive to them because lots of races have been subjected to this over time, like Asian Americans, Irish, Japanese, you name it, over time, different forms of that. Also that the Jim Crow laws of the first half of the 1900s and late 1800s, they managed to solidify and codify a caste-like system after the end of the Civil War. And this was based on their formalized segregation laws and other things. Interestingly, she talks in the book about the fact that many laws that we used were based on some other countries, and frankly, other countries came to study what we were doing and used it. Probably the most notorious of which, frankly, was Nazi Germany. It's well documented. They sent a lot of people over here to study what the southern states had been doing and liked it and adopted some of those things. Not everything, but some of those things. So that's his own. And then other things like eugenics, which started overseas, came back over here and was popular, was implicitly a part of that. I want to caveat this too and say this because this is one of the controversies. She was not saying that Nazism, all its forms came from the U.S. Clearly, what the Nazis did went way beyond anything they learned from anybody in the U.S. and when their visits to the U.S. But just some of the things they started with in the early periods did. And it's also important to note that explicit caste-like features have reduced in the last 50 years, but the reality is, if you examine it, that there still exist in the U.S. many subtler forms of systemic, implicit, and explicit racism. And she spends a lot of time in the book explaining what those are and talking about them. And then the last thing I highlighted here is a key point is that this is not just an academic exercise to rename something and say, okay, fine, what do we know about that? Her point is that if we understand the subtleties and importance of that, then we can learn from it, and allows us to focus on and eliminate some of the impact of a caste-like structure. This is a summary of it's in her book, and it's been pretty well accepted too, of some of the things that people believe are indicators of a caste-like system. And I'm not going to go through all these in detail, but some of these are self-evident. Like some of it is just divine will, the belief that this is preordained, that all races are different, and that we should treat them that way, that it's heritable, that people, this is the eugenics part, come from one to the other, that we have to have sex and marriage laws that prohibit caste from mixing, can't have purity, we have to maintain purity. It applies to jobs and occupations. It's very dehumanizing. Terror and cruelty are used as ways of inflicting and maintaining the caste system, and that there are lots of inherent superiority and inferiority castes that are placed upon them that help to enforce this whole system. And again, she goes through these one by one and explains both historical and even current real-time examples of where that's true. So it helps to put it in context a little bit to see what's going on and where that's true, and how that's evolved over time. As an kind of an overall summary, I want to just kind of highlight here what came out of the book. I mean, she makes some recommendations at the end that are important. What can we do about all this instead of just learning about it academically? One is we can make people aware of the presence of a caste-like system in the U.S. and its implications. It's good to know about that. It's good to know more about the subtlety of it. We can clearly support people who've broken free from that and give them all the energy they need and the support to help make them successful role models for other people. We can see people as individuals and don't treat them as a group, and get away from the identity-based politics and treat people as not a homogenous group, or as a homogenous group, that it is all together in the world of humanity, and eliminate dehumanization. And then lastly, we can vote with it, know what's going on and find it in current politics and try to eradicate that when we see it. So that's the short version. Like I said, this is not a short book. It's not a necessarily easy read. It's easy to understand and follow. It's just can be painful at times, but I found it well worthwhile, and I'd recommend it to anybody who wants to take the time to understand it and get a better feeling of what's been happening in the U.S. and how that relates to the current events and some of the things we're seeing happening even today, and probably will continue to see for some time. So I'll stop with that. If anybody has any questions, I don't know if we have enough time for that, but I'm happy to take questions offline from anybody who wants to.
All right. Well, thanks,
Wants
Mark.
to follow up with that. So
Yeah, thanks, Mark.